June 30th, 1944, somewhere over the Marianas. The Pacific night was heavy, a sky of ink and silence. Beneath it, a lone Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber slipped through cloud layers, engines humming low, its black-painted fuselage almost invisible against the void. The crew flew by instinct. No radar, no lights, only moonlight brushing the ocean far below. But high above them, another machine prowled the dark, one they could not see. Two twin engines whispered in perfect sync. Inside, a three-man crew watched a small glowing green circle. A blip moved across it, faint, pulsing, alive. The radar operator murmured coordinates. The pilot adjusted trim. The gunner's turret turned slowly, tracking a target they hadn't yet seen with their eyes. Within seconds, the P-61 Black Widow slid behind the bomber. The first burst of .50 caliber fire tore through the night. Tracer arcs cut brief orange scars across the darkness. The Japanese crew never saw their hunter. Only light, heat, and silence. It was the birth of a new kind of warfare. A war where men hunted ghosts, guided not by vision, but by radar. By 1942, darkness had become Japan's greatest ally. When daylight over the Pacific belonged to American carrier planes and B-17s, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy turned to the hours after sunset. Across New Guinea, the Solomons, and the Philippines, night raids became routine. Twin-engine G4M Bettys and Kai-21 Sally bombers slipped through black skies toward Allied bases, their propellers droning like insects over jungle canopies. Searchlights raked the clouds, anti-aircraft guns spat blindly, and frightened ground crews could only guess where the enemy was. Radar, the new, secret weapon of the war, was still primitive in the Pacific. The British had developed it before the Battle of Britain, but America's early sets were bulky, short-ranged, and difficult to keep operational in humid island conditions. Ground radar could sometimes detect incoming aircraft, but there was no reliable way to guide a fighter to intercept them. Pilots who tried were chasing ghosts in the dark. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, at Port Moresby, and later on Saipan, commanders experimented desperately. They fitted searchlights on trucks, mounted flares on interceptors, and tried to coordinate radio spotting from radar stations. It rarely worked. American P-38s, P-39s, and P-40s could not find targets at night. Most were too fast, too unstable in blackout conditions, and lacked radar of their own. Night after night, the Japanese exploited this blindness. Their bombers struck fuel depots, airstrips, and barracks, often killing men who never even saw a silhouette. For weary ground crews, the night meant sleeplessness and helpless rage. Even when a bomber was hit, the wreckage was usually found miles away, the blackened jungle a silent witness to unseen battles. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army Air Forces knew that Europe faced the same problem. German Ju-88s and He-111s had conducted devastating night raids over Britain, forcing the RAF to create a specialized branch, Fighter Command's Night Fighter Squadrons. Their solution was ingenious. Pairing Bristol Beaufighters and later de Havilland Mosquitoes with onboard radar operators. The pilot and his unseen navigator hunted by radio waves instead of moonlight. America watched closely. Before the U.S. even entered the war, engineers at MIT's Radiation Laboratory began refining airborne radar, codenamed SCR-520 and later SCR-720. The technology worked, but no existing American aircraft could carry it effectively. The equipment was large, heavy, and power-hungry. A new machine had to be built from the ground up, one that could lift a full radar system, a crew of 3, and enough armament to destroy bombers with a single pass. By late 1940, Northrop Aircraft, under the direction of Jack Northrop himself, proposed something radical, a twin-boom, twin-engine fighter with a central pod for the crew, 4 20mm cannons in the belly, and a rotating dorsal turret. The design looked alien. Black, broad-winged with long, thin tail booms and no nose. Its shape wasn't meant for beauty. It was meant to carry radar. They called it the XP-61. The Air Corps called it something else, the Black Widow. Development began in secret at Hawthorne, California. Engineers battled problems of balance, drag, and weight. The SCR-720 radar, imported from British research, could detect aircraft at over 5 miles. A revelation for its time. But the challenge was how to train pilots and radar operators to work as one, reading screens, plotting vectors, and attacking targets they could not see. In the early years, few believed the concept would work. Some generals insisted radar belonged on the ground, not in the air. Others claimed night fighting would never decide battles in the Pacific, where distances were too vast and navigation too treacherous. Yet by 1943, as Japanese raids intensified over the Solomons and the Philippines, reports from British night fighter units in Europe began to change minds. The British were shooting down German bombers with eerie precision. Their pilots described closing in on unseen targets, guided only by radar echoes and disembodied voices over the intercom. American commanders saw the future, and the future was invisible. Still, there was one obstacle: time. The P-61 would not be ready for frontline service until mid-1944. In the meantime, American units made do with modified P-70s. Douglas A-20 Havocs converted into crude night fighters with borrowed radar and extra guns. They were slow and underpowered, but they gave airmen a taste of the new kind of warfare that was coming. By the time the first production P-61s rolled off the line, the Pacific night was ready for a change. The hunters would finally have eyes in the dark. The first operational P-61 rolled out of Northrop's Hawthorne plant in the spring of 1944, a machine unlike anything the U.S. Army Air Forces had ever fielded. Its long, black-painted fuselage absorbed moonlight. Its radar nose, made of smooth, dark plastic, hid the secret heart of the aircraft, the SCR-720 radar set. To the men who saw it for the first time, it looked predatory. The twin Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engines gave it a deep, thunderous growl. The pilot sat under a high bubble canopy, flanked by a radar operator behind him and a gunner above in the remote-controlled turret. The crew worked in near darkness, each face dimly lit by the glow of the radar scope, a pale green eye that pierced the void. By June, the first units trained at Hammer Field. California and Orlando, Florida were ready for deployment. Among them was the 6th Night Fighter Squadron, which had endured months of frustration in the Pacific with P-70s. Its pilots were veterans of Guadalcanal and New Guinea, men who knew what it meant to fly through tropical storms by dead reckoning. The arrival of the P-61 felt like a miracle, a weapon built for their world. Training was brutal. Crews had to learn to trust instruments more than instincts. The radar operator became the pilot's lifeline, calling out heading, range, and altitude changes through a constant stream of clipped commands. Target 2 o'clock high, range 2 miles, closing fast. The pilot responded with smooth, unseen movements. In the dark, even the smallest error could mean missing the target completely, or colliding with it. The Black Widow's radar system, derived from the British AI MEMKDX, could detect aircraft up to 6 miles away and track them within a few hundred feet. It used rotating antennas behind its opaque nose cone, sending and receiving pulses that mapped the sky in invisible arcs. On the radar screen, the operator saw faint blips, one for the target, one for their own aircraft, and guided the pilot to align them. In tests, the system worked flawlessly. In combat, it would change the night itself. By July 1944, the 6th Night Fighter Squadron began deploying to the Marianas. The timing was perfect. The U.S. had just captured Saipan and Tinian, bringing Japan's inner defensive line within bomber range. But with that advance came renewed danger. Nightly Japanese raids attempting to destroy the new B-29 bases before they became operational. At Isley Field on Saipan, crews worked under blackout. Generators hummed, mechanics wiped sweat from their foreheads, and men slept beside their planes, waiting for radar alerts that might come at any hour. The first P-61s were assembled under camouflage netting, guarded like secrets. Many ground personnel had never even heard of an aircraft with radar. Then came the first intercepts. Late one night, ground radar detected Japanese bombers inbound from Iwo Jima. The call went out. Engines roared. 2 P-61s lifted into the dark, guided by vectors from a radar station. At 10,000 feet, their own radar picked up movement. Faint, distant, the operator's calm voice filled the intercom, leading the pilot closer, closer, until he could see the target's exhaust flicker against the stars. The gunner, perched above, swung the turret and squeezed the trigger. 4 50-caliber guns erupted in flame. The tracer line reached the bomber, and in seconds it disintegrated in a bright, tumbling fireball that fell toward the sea. That kill, the first confirmed P-61 victory in the Pacific, was more than just revenge for months of helpless nights. It marked the dawn of a new discipline in aerial warfare, radar-guided interception. As word spread through the Pacific bases, morale shifted. Japanese night crews began to report strange encounters, enemy fighters appearing suddenly out of the darkness, striking without warning, then vanishing. They couldn't understand how Americans found them in pitch-black skies. Many believed the U.S. had developed some kind of supernatural detection device. They weren't entirely wrong. By late 1944, more night fighter squadrons arrived, including the 418th and 421st. The aircraft received upgrades, improved SCR-720C radar, better gun turrets, and even matte coatings to reduce glare from searchlights. Crews developed hand signals and intercom codes to coordinate in total darkness. Each mission added lessons: how to identify friendly bombers by radar signature, how to ambush formations without visual contact, and how to conserve fuel while patrolling vast ocean sectors. In a war dominated by carriers and daylight battles, the P-61 introduced a new kind of psychological warfare: the fear of unseen death. From the Marianas to the Philippines, a new rumor began circulating among Japanese crews. The Americans have demons that fly at night, and soon, those demons would arrive over Okinawa. Every war has its rhythm. In the Pacific, daylight meant noise. Bombers droning, sirens howling, waves breaking against beaches filled with steel. But night was different. Night was suspense. When the P-61 arrived, it didn't just bring radar. It brought silence back to American pilots. For the first time, men who once groped blindly through the dark began to trust the invisible. Their eyes stared at glowing scopes instead of stars. Their ears became their compass. Each mission began the same way. The pilot, radar operator, and gunner climbed into the black fuselage, sealing the canopy shut. The only light inside came from a soft green radar screen. The operator, usually a second lieutenant barely in his 20s, adjusted the dials, his voice steady through the intercom. Sweep clear. Sector green. Contact expected north by northwest. For the next hour, the aircraft became a floating nerve. The pilot's world was instruments. The operator's was echoes. Together, they formed a kind of duet. One man flying blind, the other seeing without eyes. When they made contact, the tone in their voices changed. A quiet tension, a controlled urgency. The pilot eased the throttle. The operator counted down, range 2 miles. 1, half, target dead ahead. Then came the visual confirmation. A shadow sliding against starlight, a silver edge of wings reflecting the moon. The gunner aligned his turret, his thumb brushing the trigger, and for a brief second, the darkness erupted into light. The bomber disintegrated. Then nothing again. Silence, static, black. For Japanese air crews, that silence was terror. They called the attackers yokai no hikoki, ghost planes. Before radar, night operations had been a game of luck. Pilots navigated by coastal fires or star patterns, dropping bombs on guesswork. But once radar entered the sky, luck vanished. Every movement could be tracked. Every flare or exhaust flicker could betray a position. American tactics evolved quickly. Ground radar stations in the Marianas and Philippines began coordinating with airborne P-61s, guiding them into attack zones. These GCI, ground-controlled intercept, systems acted as a second set of eyes, vectoring the fighters toward enemy formations long before they were visible. Once inside radar range, the Black Widow's onboard operator took over, fine-tuning the pursuit until the pilot could make visual contact. The system was revolutionary. Before 1944, interception success rates at night were under 10%. By late 1944, with the P-61 and GCI coordination, they soared above 50%. The change was immediate and devastating. The human toll was hidden in that success. Operating at night meant living between exhaustion and adrenaline. Crews returned at dawn with eyes bloodshot from staring at dim screens. Radar operators' hands often shook after landing. The stress of interpreting weak, flickering signals in combat was immense. Many compared it to trying to find a heartbeat in static. Yet they trusted the machine and each other. The relationship between pilot and radar operator became one of absolute faith. In darkness, the operator became the voice of survival. He knew what the pilot could not see, and sometimes that voice was the only thing standing between life and death. Some pilots described the experience as almost supernatural. The radar scope showed only 2 blips, one for themselves, one for the enemy. Closing that distance felt like chasing a ghost through dimensions. When they finally made visual contact, it was as if a curtain had lifted, the real world emerging out of abstraction for just a moment before dissolving again. Meanwhile, the Japanese side faced a cruel paradox. Their aircraft were light and fast in daylight, perfect for hit-and-run raids, but utterly unprepared for night combat. They had no airborne radar, and their instruments were poor even by 1940s standards. They relied on navigation lights and guesswork, both deadly under a radar-equipped enemy. Japanese bases tried to respond with anti-aircraft searchlights and limited night patrols, but these often exposed their own planes to radar-guided interceptors. The Americans learned to exploit this, waiting for searchlights to sweep the sky, then diving through blind spots to ambush bombers illuminated by their own defenders. By late 1944, the psychological shift was complete. The Japanese had once owned the night. Now they feared it. Still, to the men of the P-61 squadrons, each mission carried its own burden. Unlike daylight fighters who saw their kills and their enemies' faces, night fighter crews saw only signals, fire, and debris. The war for them was intimate yet faceless. It required precision, not fury. They didn't chase glory. They chased echoes, and every echo could mean another life saved below. A fuel dump spared, a bomber intercepted, a base that would live to see daylight. It was warfare reduced to pure coordination. Man, machine, and mathematics working in darkness. But behind that technological miracle was something deeper, the quiet courage to fight an enemy you could never see, and that courage would soon be tested over some of the most dangerous skies of the war. To understand the Black Widow, one must understand how radical it was. Every line of the aircraft was built for purpose, not appearance. The twin-boom structure gave it balance and room for massive engines. The central nacelle housed the crew in tight quarters, 3 men surrounded by glowing instruments, dials, and ammunition feeds. Its skin was painted with non-reflective black paint that devoured light. Even the propeller tips were dulled to eliminate flash, but its true weapon wasn't the cannons or the turret. It was the black dome at its nose, a radar set powerful enough to detect a bomber before a human eye could glimpse it. The SCR-720 radar pulsed energy at 3,000 megacycles per second, reading the sky in invisible waves. Each pulse returned a reflection, turning distance into a flicker on a cathode tube. To the untrained, it looked like nonsense. To a skilled operator, it was a map of death. In an era when many pilots still distrusted instruments, this invisible sense changed the nature of flight. It was the first time in human history that machines allowed men to fight beyond the limits of their own sight. The radar's capabilities went beyond detection. It could distinguish formation sizes, estimate altitude, and even help track ships at sea. Its British creators had called it the eye that never sleeps. In the Pacific, it became a predator's instinct. Always awake, always aware, the P-61's radar operators learned to interpret subtleties. A weak echo meant a small plane. A sharp, bright pulse indicated metal-heavy bombers, and an erratic signal could mean evasive maneuvers. Operators developed signature recognition. They could identify a Japanese Betty, Sally, or Kai-46 simply by the rhythm of the radar returns. To Japanese pilots, the effect was terrifyingly one-sided. Many never knew they were being hunted until their aircraft exploded. Others reported strange lights or invisible planes that attacked from nowhere. Japanese intelligence intercepted fragments of Allied reports mentioning airborne radar, but disbelief lingered. Some commanders dismissed the accounts as American propaganda. Impossible technology meant to demoralize them. Still, Japan tried to adapt. By early 1945, their engineers had begun experiments with primitive radar sets, the FD-2 and Type 3Q, but they were unreliable and scarce. Few planes could carry them, and power supplies often failed mid-flight. Others tried deception, dropping strips of aluminum foil called Gimen-shi, based on the British chaff concept, to confuse radar signals. But the Black Widow's SCR-720 was advanced enough to filter them out. In desperation, Japanese pilots began flying at treetop level or along coastlines to mask their radar signature, but this left them vulnerable to crashes and ground fire. Even nature seemed to betray them. The hot, humid Pacific air reflected radar signals better than dry European skies, amplifying American detection ranges. To the men inside the P-61, each successful intercept felt less like combat and more like physics at work. Radar turned the air war into an equation. The enemy was a point of light. The solution was range, closure rate, and altitude correction. Then came the burst of fire, and the point vanished. But that precision brought new psychological questions. Pilots often described the surreal experience of killing an enemy they never truly saw. There was no dogfight, no face-to-face duel, only radar readings, commands, and the brief flash of destruction. It was war reduced to impulses and instruments. Some called it the coldest kind of combat. The moral weight was real. Night fighter crews spoke of returning to base with empty feelings. Not exhilaration, just silence. They hadn't fought men, they'd fought signals. One pilot later said, "You didn't feel victory. You felt like a machine that had done its job." Yet, in that disconnection lay the future of warfare. The P-61 foreshadowed a world where detection would matter more than courage, where radar, not eyesight, would define who lived and who died. It marked the birth of the information age in combat. The Japanese, once masters of surprise, now faced their own invisibility turned against them. In 1942, they had struck Pearl Harbor under cover of stealth. In 1945, American radar negated that very advantage. Night and distance, once their shields, became traps. Technically, the P-61's firepower sealed the equation. Beneath its belly, 4 20mm Hispano cannons could shred a bomber with a single burst. Its upper turret, controlled electrically, housed 4 50-caliber Brownings that could pivot 360 degrees, lethal against smaller aircraft or defensive formations. Together, they formed one of the deadliest combinations ever flown before the jet age. The plane could climb to 33,000 feet, cruise at over 350 miles per hour, and fly nearly 1,000 miles on internal fuel. For night interception, it was perfect. Fast enough to catch bombers, stable enough to track them. Even its nickname carried weight, the Black Widow, named after the venomous spider whose prey never saw it coming. Japanese pilots soon learned to listen for the low hum of twin radials in the dark. Too heavy for a Zero, too quiet for a B-25. When they heard that sound, it was often too late. The irony was clear. A war once fought through vision had entered a phase where sight meant nothing. Technology had inverted instinct. By 1945, the Black Widow was more than an aircraft. It was a symbol of how quickly warfare could evolve. It bridged the gap between the romantic dogfights of the 1940s and the electronic battles that would define the Cold War. And over the islands of Luzon, Okinawa, and the South China Sea, it was about to prove just how deadly that evolution could be. Luzon, January 1945. The war in the Pacific had reached its most violent tempo. Japan's empire was contracting fast, yet its air units fought with the desperation of the doomed. Kamikaze attacks had begun to target American fleets and bases, and night raids returned with new ferocity. At Lingayen Gulf, American ships lay at anchor under blackout orders. The humid air shimmered with the scent of diesel and salt. Every man aboard could sense it, something moving in the dark. At 2140 hours, the radar station at Clark Field picked up faint echoes, a formation inbound from the north. Within minutes, the call went out to the 418th Night Fighter Squadron. 2 Black Widows lifted from the runway, their propellers carving silver arcs in the moonlight. Inside the cockpit of the lead plane, Lieutenant Paul Smith adjusted his oxygen mask, glancing at the green radar screen glowing between him and his operator, Lieutenant Robert Tierney. The voice in Tierney's headset was calm but sharp. Multiple returns, Angels 10, range 7 miles, closing. For the next 10 minutes, they climbed through haze and cloud. Lightning flashed over the mountains, briefly illuminating the outline of their twin booms. At 15,000 feet, the operator saw it, a cluster of bright blips moving in formation. Japanese bombers, likely Bettys, heading toward the bay. Contact. Vector right. 2 miles. Steady rate, Smith banked gently, throttles forward. The darkness outside was absolute. Only the instruments gave life any meaning. His hands moved by instinct, guided by Tierney's voice. 1 mile. Half a mile. Then, a faint shadow. The bomber's exhausts flickered like embers against the night. Visual confirmed. The turret swiveled. The gunner pressed the trigger. 4 50-caliber guns tore open the sky. Tracers streaked forward, intersecting the bomber's tail. The enemy aircraft erupted in a brief blossom of orange light, breaking formation instantly. 2 more P-61s arrived behind, radar-guided, unseen until the moment of attack. Within 5 minutes, the Japanese formation was gone. 3 bombers destroyed, 1 crashed into the sea, the rest scattering toward the coast. Not a single American ship was hit that night. The engagement, later recorded as one of the first fully radar-controlled multi-target interceptions in the Pacific, proved beyond doubt that darkness no longer belonged to Japan. Across the theater, similar reports began to pour in. Over Mindoro, Saipan, and Iwo Jima, night fighter crews intercepted and destroyed bombers long before they reached their objectives. The P-61's combination of radar and firepower had created a new kind of tactical certainty. Predict, close, kill, disappear. The Japanese response grew frantic. Their pilots tried to hug cloud layers or dive into valleys to break radar contact, but the Black Widows followed them down with eerie precision. When visibility vanished entirely, the operators tracked them by echo alone, a heartbeat of pulses in the static. In one recorded mission, Captain Lee Kendall of the 548th Squadron pursued a single bomber for 40 minutes through rain and turbulence. His radar operator, Sergeant Arthur "Red" Simmons, guided him entirely by instrument, adjusting course by degrees. At last, the signal brightened. Kendall climbed slightly, the cloud thinned, and there it was. A Betty flying low over the ocean. One burst. A fireball reflected on the waves. Kendall later said, "It was like finding a whisper in a hurricane." These victories weren't about numbers. They were about control. The Americans could now dictate when and how combat occurred, something unthinkable 2 years earlier. On the ground, mechanics began painting kill marks on the noses of their widows, white silhouettes glowing faintly against the black fuselage. Each represented not just a victory, but a turning of the tide in psychological warfare. For Japanese crews, the experience was disorienting and terrifying. Reports from surviving pilots described being chased by invisible planes or attacked from blind directions. Some believed the Americans had learned to see in the dark. Others blamed betrayal by their own navigation lights. But no explanation could match the truth. They were being hunted by radar. In Tokyo, commanders tried to adapt strategy. Orders were issued forbidding formation flying at night, hoping to confuse interceptors. But without formation discipline, accuracy plummeted. Bombers became isolated targets, perfect prey for the P-61. Each success brought refinement. Radar operators fine-tuned procedures, developing a code system. Snap meant target lost. Ghost meant false return. Hammer meant visual contact confirmed. The teamwork became second nature. Some crews developed such instinctive coordination that they could complete an entire interception with barely a dozen words exchanged. By early 1945, the night belonged to the Black Widow. Still, the battles ahead would demand even more. Japan's final defense lines, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, would bring the most concentrated kamikaze raids of the war. For those missions, the P-61 would not only intercept bombers, but prevent suicide planes from ever reaching their targets. And in those crucibles, radar would meet desperation head-on. Okinawa, April 1945. The largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War had begun. Across 60 miles of coastline, the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet faced a relentless storm. Japanese aircraft poured in daily, not just bombers, but kamikazes, their pilots ready to die to destroy American ships. During the day, F-6F Hellcats and Corsairs ruled the skies. But when night fell, the threat only changed shape. Japan's night raiders came low and silent, often single planes carrying 500-pound bombs or diving suicidally at transports. The radar picket ships ringing the island were the first to spot them, faint echoes sliding across phosphor screens. And almost every night, one phrase echoed through the fleet's communications: Black Widows airborne. At Aishima and Kadena airfields, the P-61 squadrons stood ready. Their engines were kept warm long after sunset. Ground crews crouched in dim light as they loaded ammunition belts and checked the radar nose cones for moisture. When the scramble order came, the twin-boom fighters lifted into the black Pacific sky, their red navigation lights blinking once, then vanishing into nothing. For most pilots, Okinawa was the defining test of the aircraft's design and doctrine. The weather was brutal, the nights thick with haze and rain, and the enemy unpredictable. Yet the P-61's radar saw through it all. One of the most famous missions came on May 3, 1945. When Lieutenant Hermann Ernst and his crew of the 548th Night Fighter Squadron intercepted a Japanese bomber approaching the fleet at 8,000 feet. The radar operator, Sergeant Edward Kopsel, locked on at 12 miles. Slowly, the blip grew stronger. They closed in, matching altitude. Through scattered cloud, Ernst caught a faint red glow, the enemy's exhaust. He fired a short burst from the four 20mm cannons. The rounds tore through the bomber's wing root, igniting its fuel tanks. The aircraft exploded mid-air, scattering debris across the sea. It was over in seconds. Moments later, Kopsel spotted another target, this one smaller, faster. A kamikaze diving toward radar ship USS Pickens. Ernst pulled into a steep chase. Guided by Kopsel's calm voice, he closed from below, throttles wide. At 2,000 feet, he opened fire again. The tracer stream met the kamikaze head-on. The explosion lit the clouds from within, a silent orange bloom above the waves. The Pickens survived unscathed. That night, the Black Widow earned its legend. Across Okinawa, similar encounters unfolded. The radar-guided night fighters became the Navy's unseen guardians, destroying incoming aircraft before they reached the beaches. By the end of the campaign, P-61 squadrons had claimed dozens of kills, including several kamikazes whose approach was detected solely by airborne radar. But the cost was heavy. The missions were long, the weather merciless, and the tension unrelenting. Radar operators worked until their eyes blurred, straining to separate real signals from interference. Pilots fought vertigo in total darkness, relying entirely on instruments. Many never returned. A single mechanical failure, a misread altitude, or a storm front could send even the best crews into the sea. Still, their presence changed everything. Commanders could now rest men during the night, knowing someone watched the skies. Radar picket ships began coordinating with airborne P-61s, creating an early warning network stretching over hundreds of miles. The integration of radar, ground, and air had become a weapon in itself. For the Japanese, Okinawa was a nightmare they could not comprehend. Their night tactics, once effective, were now suicide missions without certainty. Reports from surviving aviators spoke of black, unseen fighters with shining eyes and bullets that came from nowhere. One pilot who escaped after being attacked at night told his debriefers it was as if the Americans had stolen the night from the gods. The truth was simpler. Science had replaced superstition. Even as the Black Widow dominated Okinawa's skies, the war's end approached. In July 1945, P-61s began patrols over the East China Sea, intercepting the last trickle of Japanese reconnaissance flights. Some of these missions pushed the aircraft to its endurance limits. 6-hour sorties through monsoon rain, guided only by radar echoes and faith in the instruments. On August 14th, the day Japan accepted surrender, a P-61 from the 548th Squadron was already airborne over Honshu. Its crew received the ceasefire order mid-flight. The operator switched off the radar. The screen faded to black. For the first time in months, there were no more blips. That same week, another P-61 crew flew a strange mission, a nighttime escort for B-29s dropping food and medical supplies over prisoner-of-war camps. The pilots flew low, using the same radar that once found enemies to now locate campfires lit by starving Allied soldiers. One airman later said, "It felt like we were hunting hope instead of bombers." In that quiet transition, the Black Widow's war ended as it had begun, in darkness. But the darkness no longer hid fear. It carried relief. The P-61 had proven itself not through spectacle, but through silence, an aircraft that turned invisibility into strategy, and the night into an American ally. When the last Japanese aircraft fell silent, the Pacific night changed forever. The P-61 Black Widow had not only ended Japan's nocturnal raids, it had rewritten the very idea of air defense. What began as an experimental response to a desperate problem became one of the most decisive technological leaps of the war. In the months after Okinawa, Allied intelligence compiled the data. Between 1944 and 1945, American night fighter squadrons had destroyed hundreds of enemy aircraft across the Pacific, China, and Burma. In the Marianas, B-29 bases that once suffered nightly bombings now operated undisturbed. The cost of building, training, and maintaining the Widow fleet had paid off in stability, morale, and saved lives. But the success of the aircraft went beyond numbers. It signaled a strategic shift, a recognition that control of the night was no longer optional but essential. Commanders who had once viewed darkness as downtime now saw it as opportunity. With radar, the U.S. could project power 24 hours a day. There was no longer a safe time for the enemy. Post-campaign reports from the Army Air Forces and Navy credited the P-61 with neutralizing the night threat. In Saipan, radar-controlled intercepts cut Japanese bombing efficiency by over 80%. On Okinawa, night fighter patrols prevented at least a dozen kamikaze attacks on anchored ships. For a force stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, that meant the difference between endurance and disaster. Yet behind the military reports were human stories of crews who had spent months fighting unseen battles. When the war ended, many of them came home quietly, without parades or fanfare. Night fighter units were small and secretive. Their victories were rarely filmed or photographed. Unlike bomber crews, they had no dramatic footage of formation flights or daylight kills. Their war had happened in the invisible. Historians would later call theirs the forgotten theater within the Pacific. The P-61 itself was both admired and misunderstood. It was the heaviest and most complex fighter America had produced during the war, At over 36,000 pounds fully loaded, it was almost as large as a medium bomber. Yet it could turn, climb, and fight with the grace of smaller aircraft. Crews who flew it swore by its stability and power. Mechanics, however, often cursed its complexity. Twin engines, radar electronics, and hydraulic turret systems required constant attention in tropical climates. Still, the plane's design had proven its worth. Unlike the earlier P-70 conversions, which were improvised stopgaps, the Black Widow was purpose-built for its role. It could loiter for hours, patrol vast distances, and engage at will. And because it operated mostly in the dark, losses were comparatively low. By August 1945, when Japan finally surrendered, only about 200 P-61s had reached the Pacific, yet their impact was disproportionate. They represented the cutting edge of Allied technology, a fusion of engineering, electronics, and human adaptability. The strategic lessons they taught echoed into the jet age. Radar, once a laboratory curiosity, became the backbone of post-war air defense. From it came a new generation of night interceptors, the Northrop F-89 Scorpion, the Douglas F-3D Skynight, and eventually the F-94 Starfire. Each of them owed their lineage and their doctrine to the Black Widow. But the greatest change was philosophical. Before the Widow, aerial combat was romanticized. Bright, agile duels under sunlight, pilots chasing glory in open skies. After the Widow, warfare became procedural, data-driven, and detached. It demanded trust in unseen instruments and cooperation between minds rather than reflexes. The U.S. Army Air Forces began formalizing airborne intercept training schools, blending mathematics, electronics, and flight tactics. Radar operators became as vital as pilots, a quiet revolution in the hierarchy of war. The technology that guided the P-61's radar blips would, within a decade, guide surface-to-air missiles and even spacecraft. Japan's military, meanwhile, was left in shock. Post-war interrogations revealed that their air command had underestimated radar entirely. Believing the Pacific's vastness made radar impractical, they had invested in speed and maneuverability instead. The Black Widow exposed that blindness. By the time Japan's first effective airborne radar prototypes reached testing in 1945, it was already too late. In Tokyo's war archives, analysts would later write a single understated line: "Our night operations were defeated not by superior numbers, but by superior knowledge." That was the real legacy of the Black Widow. The aircraft itself would remain in service until 1950, patrolling during the early Cold War and even participating in weather and test flights. But its true mark on history lay in what it proved: that the combination of human intuition and electronic sensing could overcome even the deepest uncertainty. From that moment on, no Army or Air Force would ever fight blind again. The guns fell silent, but for the men who flew through darkness, silence felt unfamiliar. When the surrender was announced in August 1945, Black Widow crews across the Pacific were still airborne on patrols. Some intercepted Japanese aircraft unaware the war was over. Others were returning to base when they heard it over the radio. All offensive operations are terminated. Repeat, cease all attacks. For many, disbelief came before relief. Their world had been radar scopes and intercom static for so long that peace felt abstract, like a signal suddenly gone off-screen. At Aishima and Okinawa, the crews gathered in small groups beside their planes. They had no parades, no bands, just humid air and exhaustion. A few men opened ration tins, toasted with tepid coffee, and stared at the silhouettes of their aircraft under the fading light. The war had ended, but the night still belonged to them. Demobilization came swiftly. Within weeks, orders arrived to transfer or discharge personnel. Many operators and gunners went home before they could even pack their gear. Entire squadrons, once secretive and vital, vanished quietly from rosters. The radar vans and maintenance sheds were dismantled. The airstrips cleared. Some Black Widows were ferried back to the United States, others left behind or stripped for parts. The Pacific sun faded their matte black paint to dull charcoal. Mechanics joked that even in peace the planes preferred the dark. For those who had lived inside them, the separation was bittersweet. The aircraft had been more than a weapon. It was a shared cocoon, a place of trust where three men became one mind. Pilots spoke of missing the rhythmic hum of the twin engines, the glow of the radar screen, the calm voice of their operator guiding them through black clouds. In letters and memoirs, many admitted they never felt more alive than in those quiet, dangerous hours. The radar pulse had been both heartbeat and compass, the sound of purpose itself. Yet the military machine moved forward. Radar technology, once classified, began spreading rapidly into civilian and research use. Former operators found work at universities, electronics firms, and the newly formed U.S. Air Force. What they had learned under fire, waveform reading, signal interpretation, atmospheric interference, became the foundation of early air traffic control and meteorology systems. Their combat instincts built the post-war world's radar grids. Meanwhile, the aircraft itself entered legend only slowly. Compared to glamorous fighters like the P-51 Mustang or P-47 Thunderbolt, the Black Widow was an enigma, too specialized, too secret, and too nocturnal to fit into public imagination. But among those who understood, its reputation only grew. Air historians called it the first American aircraft designed around an idea instead of a gun. It had proven that data could win wars, that an invisible signal, properly read, could be deadlier than 1,000 searchlights. The Widow's descendants carried that spirit forward. The Korean War's jet interceptors used miniature versions of the SCR-720 radar. Cold War bombers relied on radar navigation based on systems born inside the P-61's nose cone. Even NASA test pilots later studied its stability for early space research. Yet perhaps the most poetic tribute came not from engineers, but from one of its last wartime pilots. In a 1947 interview, Captain Harold C. Wilson, who had scored several night victories over the Philippines, said, "We didn't just fight the enemy. We fought the dark, and the Widow taught us that the dark could be conquered." He was right. The P-61's era was brief, but its impact was lasting. It had turned fear into precision, chaos into calculation. And though it would soon be replaced by sleeker, faster jets, no aircraft ever again entered battle blind. By 1950, the last operational Black Widows flew weather reconnaissance missions over Alaska, tracing storms instead of bombers. Their radar watched the sky for thunder instead of war. The same antennas that once guided men toward death now helped others predict life-saving forecasts. It was a quiet ending, fitting for a plane born from silence. In museums today, a few restored P-61s rest under soft lighting, their black surfaces gleaming faintly like onyx. Visitors walk past without always noticing the small round radar dome at the nose, the true heart of the aircraft, the piece that changed everything. Few realize that inside that smooth, dark shell once pulsed the sound of human ingenuity at its purest, the desire to see through the unknown. The Black Widow was born from fear, the fear of blindness in war, but it ended as a triumph of understanding. In the Pacific, men had once stared into empty skies, powerless against what they could not see. Then came a machine that made the invisible visible, not through magic, but through mathematics, pulse, and patience. It transformed night from chaos into order, from superstition into science. The aircraft itself was only metal, wires, and radar tubes. Yet, inside it, humanity revealed something profound, that courage was not only about charging into light, but about navigating darkness with calm. Each mission demanded a different kind of bravery, the courage to trust instruments, to trust each other, and to act without ever seeing the face of the enemy. When the Black Widow first took flight, radar was still experimental. By the time it landed for the last time, radar had become the eye of the modern world, guiding planes, mapping weather, protecting nations. The same waves that once hunted bombers would go on to monitor storms, track satellites, and explore the surface of distant planets. In that sense, the war's darkest hours gave birth to the technology that now watches over peace. Every pulse that echoed through a P-61 scope was a small defiance of uncertainty, proof that knowledge, once found, could replace fear. The men who flew them didn't just win battles. They changed how humanity understood the night itself. And perhaps that is the lasting legacy of the Black Widow. That in every era, progress begins the same way, with someone staring into the dark and deciding to look deeper.